I'm Quentin Hardy, and it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Sir Nigel Shadbolt is Professor of Computer Science at the University of Oxford and a Principal of Jesus College. He is also Chairman and co-founder of the Open Data Institute, which we'll be speaking about tonight. In 2009, Sir Nigel was appointed Information Advisor to the UK government, helping transform public access to government information, including the widely acclaimed data.gov.uk site. Please see tonight's program flyer for his full biography. Please join me in welcoming Sir Nigel Shadbolt for a conversation on open data and artificial intelligence. I think the best way to begin is to just try and set a couple of definitions. What is artificial intelligence?
Well, let's start with a really easy question.
Yeah.
Actually, it is a hard question because when we think about our own notions of what it is to be intelligent, psychologists and philosophers have struggled over this question for generations. And it's also the case, I think, when we think about artificial intelligence. What are we trying to build? And so for some people, it's kind of the art of building computers like the ones in the movies, you know, the kind of self-aware, mad, bad, and dangerous to know computers. In other cases, it's about building a machine to build and behave very adaptably, to learn from the information that's going in, to be flexible. What are the hallmarks of intelligence is a kind of a really interesting question in itself. And as we explore aspects of that, whether it's adaptability, whether it's self-improvement, whether it's actually being able to explain the reasons for a conclusion, we get different facets of that question, I think, about what is intelligence. We might know what the artificial is. The intelligence piece is a bit more challenging.
It seems to me too often that people in the industry are victims of their own language, using terms like intelligence and brain and mind. Most of the time, from what I've seen, it's pattern finding. It's pattern finding and pattern matching, which is something intelligence does. But it may or may not be anything like human intelligence, which leads me to my next question. What is artificial intelligence not?
Well, you'd be thinking, if you were to listen to some of the news and marketing, that it's going to be everything and it's going to solve all our problems and possibly even eliminate us. I mean, all of these things. Us. Yeah, it's kind of like very, very substantially over-egged or hyped at the moment. I think there are really interesting reasons why we're at a transition point in some ways, but it's not for the reasons people think. It's not about the machines are about to replace us or about to wake up and become self-aware. It's much more about understanding what they can and can't do, as you say, and the narrowness of those capabilities. The striking thing about an AI program is when you open it up and look in the code base, what's not there in terms of what is there when we think about our own social cognition, our own emotional states, what makes us human and capable. But there's no doubt that we're going to build classes of system that have this fantastic pattern-finding capability, this adaptability, this ability to feel responsive that will occasionally spook us out. It'll feel a bit uncanny, and I think that's another characteristic. But it's often smart, but not smart like us. Right.
Oh, you got to say more about that right away.
Well,
I said right, and then I realized there's more.
Actually, it's not original to me. There was a very eminent professor of AI at MIT called Patrick Winston, and he had this phrase, you know, there's lots of ways of being smart that isn't smart like us. When he was asked the question about what is AI, and he was saying, imagine a space of possible intelligent systems. We occupy one part of it. But there are lots of ways of being flexible and adaptive. And I could build you a pure game-playing genius program. In fact, we just have AlphaGo, DeepMind's AlphaGo, that beats the best players in one of the most difficult games, we thought, in terms of pattern recognition. But it's not having a discussion in philosophy, and it doesn't write good poetry. You know, this is the whole issue around this is what are the extent and limits of these systems that we build, and how narrow is their compass. And maybe what we're doing in AI really is building lots of narrow task-achieving capabilities, which when we put them together, seem interesting, but individually they still don't amount to a general intelligence.
Peter Drucker said a mouse is good at being a mouse, and an elephant is good at being an elephant. You don't expect a mouse to be an elephant.
No.
And similarly, you expect these things to solve patterns, but now in increasingly spooky ways. Yep. Things have happened in the past 15 years, say, that makes for this revival of artificial intelligence. And you've been in the field since 1978. So what happened now? And it must have been quite exciting for you to see it take place.
It's been very exciting. I mean, to the point you made earlier, though, it's interesting that when we do get these triumphs in AI, and if you remember back, some of you remember back to 1996 when IBM's Deep Blue beat Gary Kasparov. You know, that was a high watermark, we thought at that point. What's happening in AI? Are they going to wake up and take over, remove all our jobs? And they didn't. But at that point, Kasparov was also rather unnerved by the program, you know, and in some sense, it was easy to endow the program with different capabilities than it actually had. What it was doing was searching hundreds of millions of positions a second. You know, it wasn't playing chess like a human does, but it was able to manifest extraordinary performance in that area.
And likewise, when it won at Jeopardy, the real advantage was it didn't hesitate going to the buzzer.
No.
When it had an answer, it immediately hit.
And when you saw that, it kind of felt spooky, you know, it's unreasonable speed and accuracy of response. And IBM had trained a great games player. What was different about Watson, IBM's Watson, and what's different now is the availability of huge amounts of data. And I think that's what's making a difference. It's simply the case that we wouldn't have imagined 30 years ago when I was first in the field, beginning into the field, and we were looking at computational linguistics. How do you get machines to understand language? In a way, we reached for grammars, we reached for very elegant ways of describing how language structure worked, because we didn't have databases full of billions of examples of sentences and pages. We have that now. We can build models that translate language and understand the implications, answer questions in a way that is entirely different than the methods we had to use 30 years when the data was much sparser. So I think data everywhere is the thing that's making this latest phase of AI very powerful.
What was extraordinary was the browser turned out to be a kind of sensor, and a sensor for all sorts of things. Obviously, the content of web pages in different languages, but also links, time people spent looking at things, where they went next, what they related to, a sensor of desires in a sense. And now we've blown that onto cell phones and all sorts of other things. That model is in the physical world, so there's 3 dimensions to it.
Yeah, well, that's right. And the genius...
It's just getting richer.
The genius of the Google result, the original kind of search engine result, was to realize that those hyperlinks, all those links on all those pages that humans were making, represented an expression of interest and relevance.
And at the same time, computing became so much cheaper, so that you and your colleagues could suddenly do things, revive old algorithms and write new ones. Well,
it is the case that since I kind of completed my PhD in AI and to about now, there's been well over a million-fold increase in the power of the machines. 6 orders of magnitude. You know, we talk about exponents in the world, but actually very few areas, and I would say that computing is one of them. These rates of change are so remarkable that methods, brute force methods, with a little insight, take you a very long way.
Yes. Now, people think artificial intelligence is something on the horizon, and it may look like Arnold Schwarzenegger when it gets here with some malevolence. But in fact, it's really quite in the world right now, isn't it? Yeah. How many areas do you see AI in today?
Well, if you open up your smartphone, you know, you've got about 6 or 7 right there. You know, they're running essentially products from AI labs, whether it's speech recognition or face recognition, or the question answering that's coming back, or the interrogation of the large amount of data on the web to answer your questions. Or it's in your engine management in your cars, or it's actually in the recommender systems that tell you what you might like to be interested in buying or purchasing. So, but of course that's prosaic. It's very narrow kind of capabilities, and we say, well, that's not AI. Where's the Terminator? Where's the kind of self-aware ex machina?
When will it? Yeah, when will it speak to me and look me in the eye?
And some people have a strong view that that's going to be not too far in the future. I think it's going to be a very long time in the future, as a matter of fact. And that notion of general intelligence, general artificial intelligence, is very tough. We have very little understanding of what would constitute such a thing. But in the meantime, we're busy building these extraordinarily narrow, autistic task-capable, task-achieving system.
Yeah, a computer that plays chess is quite an achievement. A computer that feels like playing chess is an almost unimaginable achievement.
So that's the gap.
We're not really there.
That's the gap, yeah.
Yeah. But that said, where do you think it will go? What is the... You can probably see a path out at least a few years. What will come next?
Well, I think we are just, again, the exponents of the field. It's a perfect storm in a way. It's increasing power of our computers. It's exponential rates of increase of the data. It's device engineering. I often say that as an AI practitioner, as a computer scientist, most of my progress I owe to electrical engineers who have kept on kind of doubling the power of the computers and doubling the capacity of the memory storage on pretty well a 15-month basis. And that has allowed us to build huge farms of machines that can hold the totality of this information and gather more and more. And I just see that the consequence of that will be a kind of a ubiquitous, distributed set of capability from everything from automated systems that advise you on your recipes to help drive your car through to translating languages from one to another. But these isolated capabilities will just move into the background in the same way that we don't think of our phones as carrying AI around on them, or the products, because they're not they're not this idea that we have of what an AI could be or should be. It doesn't mean the technology isn't there doing just a host of things for us. And that's going to, I mean, I would say if you want to take an area, pick toys, pick leisure, pick the fact that Spielberg's AI is an interesting film. The most plausible thing in it was the teddy bear. Okay, and that teddy bear, which was capable of recording and responding in an effective way to its owner, but in fact, it's not going to be self-aware, but the teddy bears of our children's and our grandchildren's future will be effectively life-logging systems. They'll be companions that the child will take. They'll affect relationships, but the teddy bear won't be looking back out, having an affectionate relationship with the child. The child may be the other way around, but they will become objects which embody large amounts of AI capability. And I can't think of an area that won't have these AI capabilities embedded in them somewhere.
I didn't expect to get this far in 15 minutes, as we say these days, but here we are. Is this going to change human consciousness? A child growing up with something like that will have expectations of what from the world?
Well, I think our tools and our technology have always changed us. I think the remarkable fact of our current state is that, we've been making tools for 4 million years probably. I mean, those very earliest hand axes, those very earliest ones, they began to shape our cortex as well as our motor responses, and they gave us mastery over the environment. And I think that has always happened. Our tools augment us, they extend us. And in just the same way, we have more information at our fingertips than Leonardo did, or Crick, or Darwin, or any of these individuals.
As the saying goes, we make tools to shape the world, and in turn they shape us.
They shape us, and they do indeed. And I think that how we will develop those notions of companionability and what sociability will mean, the things that matter to us, we have an infinite capacity as a species to anthropomorphize into objects. I remember my sister used to drag around on a piece of string a brick that was her imaginary pet friend, and she had a name for it and the rest of it, but it was a brick, but it wasn't for her. And so I think that we will project into these systems extraordinary amounts of affectation, and they will become important parts of our environment.
Mm-hmm. But it won't take away. I mean, I think tech's most pernicious proposition is we'll create a future so perfect that we won't have to be good. And we're still going to have to be good.
Well, it'll be a dual-use technology, right? I mean, so that's one of the challenges we will face with all of this, and it's always been the case. If you think of artificial intelligence and computing, well, think of our other great technologies: chemistry, chemical warfare; biology, biological warfare; nuclear warfare. And what we do with our technology is hugely important. It's not the machines waking up and deciding to do away with us that I worry about. It's the fact that our artificial intelligence plus our natural stupidity might put these things in mastery over us, and we'll give them to make decisions that are genuinely worrying. And
yeah, we can make mistakes at scale like never before.
So the technology will just do the most amazing things, but the thing we will have to co-develop and really do it fast and hard are the ethics and the regulatory structures around the deployment of these systems.
Let me just spend a minute crawling up the chip a bit. Things like deep neural networks, deep learning, transfer learning, these more advanced systems. What do you make of them? Were they real breakthroughs in this process?
I think they're very interesting illustrations of a couple of things. I would just say that AI in its history has at different times taken very different ways and developed very different methods to try and produce adaptive and flexible behavior. And in the good old days, as we were rule-based systems, logic-based systems, rules and approaches that are still out there running systems today. Then we realized that maybe we have to introduce uncertainty into these systems. So we developed the fuzzy logic and Bayesian reasoning and all sorts of families of methods to try and develop more of a toolkit of ways to build our systems.
Now, speaking as a layperson, it seems that we're really into systems now that are almost incapable of explaining themselves.
Well, that's a good point. So I think one of the interesting things about earlier generations of AI, and we used to build systems called planning systems. Planning systems would work out how to construct your house or how to do the logistics planning to get all your material from one place to another. We still use them at scale all the time, routinely. But right from the earliest days in AI, there was a different game in town, which to say, let's look at how brains are built. Let's look at building neural networks. Let's see what we can compute if we have networks that change and adapt their structure and their weights in a way that responds to inputs and gives us interesting outputs. That method, neural networks, they've been around for a very long time. And we explored them very thoroughly in the 90s, 1990s, and again in the 2000s. They were doing very interesting things. But what was happening in the meantime is that people were thinking, well, what happened if we could build arbitrarily deep neural networks, with layer on layer? Well, that would take a lot of computing. It'd take a lot of power. Hey, we've got that, And at some point, the ability to take these neural networks, load them on architecture that could run them reasonably fast, and then, to be fair, do a set of technical developments which recognize that if you've got these big network inputs, you can do a certain kind of computation on one sub-area of the network and then feed that through to another layer and another layer. So you've got lots of complicated maths being performed to look for the features and correlations in very complicated inputs.
At a very low level, you're doing elementary pattern finding and then more refined pattern finding, but then you're doing patterns on the pattern finding.
Yeah.
And they were thinking 3 layers. Now people are at, what, 7, 8?
Many layers,
yeah,
many layers, in fact. And indeed, that is one of the things that is really shifting the game. The point about those layers, when I open up the box or I look inside the kind of program, I often will see this brilliantly adapted connection graph with lots and lots of weights, and it's doing stuff. But how do I get it to explain why it's doing what it's doing?
Right. It's not even clear that if you took the machine fairly well into a game of Go or a game of chess and ran the patterns and it could expose itself afterward, that it followed the same tree up both times.
And how would you account for it? Yeah. How would you account for it? So this area is now being called algorithmic accountability, or the demand for explanation, or transparent machine learning, is a big hot area of research. So as you get this new set of capabilities, you suddenly say, well, you know what? If I'm going to use this method to run a car or make decisions on insurance classification, I may end up in court one day and being asked how to explain
where I was going
with this outcome.
They can't explain themselves. How do you regulate them? Except they're incredibly powerful in that state. So.
And that will become
we'll live with that.
That'll become a new area of research. Is an area of research, an active area of research right now.
Let's change gears for a moment and talk about what feeds this. That is to say, this enormous amount of data. and your particular passion, open data. Talk a little bit about what open data was to begin with and where it exists now and why you're so passionate about it.
Well, this is one of those things where it was kind of an necessary ingredient for a number of us. If we were going to build, one of our interests was this whole idea of building up a web of connected data. What if you could get this data, just as we have it with a web of documents, connected up in some way and treat the web as if it was a large distributed database? That could be powerful. Well, you had to get the data on there in the first place. Well, what kind of data would you have? Well, possibly data about when the trains run, or where the bus stops are, or what hospital procedures are being produced, or what prescriptions are being, what drugs are being used by your health system. Tons and tons of information which public services, initially, we were thinking in those terms, collect, use, isn't to do with personal information, isn't to do with me necessarily, but it's just the kind of stuff that makes public services run, makes the country run. Everything from the lists of legally constituted companies, everything from the kind of geography of the geospatial structure of a country, the legal boundaries, who the MPs were. This should all be open and available. The taxpayer has usually ended up paying for it to be collected in the first place. Why isn't it just openly available? And there was a whole bunch of movements at the same time that said, data of this sort should just be openly available. And the US was actually a leading player in this area. And Tim Berners-Lee and I were asked by the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, to do something similar for the UK, to open it up. And there was so much to go at. We couldn't believe how the most obvious information was just sat there in a dusty spreadsheet. You know, everything from bicycle accident statistics, where they happened, when they happened, to the fares on our trains.
Did you encounter resistance to opening all that up?
You bet. Oh, we've heard every kind of excuse on why you couldn't possibly release that data you could imagine.
What do they boil down to?
Well, often, sometimes genuine concerns about, is the data good enough? Well, publish it. If it's bad data, people will let you know pretty soon.
And frequently, they'll try to clean it up. Much better than you could.
So my favorite example here is a very prosaic one. In Britain, we finally got them to publish where the bus stops were. And there were a few 100,000 bus stops.
Breakthrough.
And how many of these bus stops would you think weren't in the place the government thought they were? Well, 8%, about 20,000 bus stops weren't where they were meant to be. Now, you know...
I hate it when that happens.
And they'd gone walkabout for various good reasons, or they were never recorded properly in the right way. But within weeks of this stuff being released, it was cleaned up. Yeah. So we think that's just such a powerful. They open data as an innovation base. My other favorite examples in transport. In London, easily the best app to get you around the place. Well, one of them is a thing called City Mapper. It's built using lots and lots of open data, and that data, much of it comes from an outfit called Transport for London. They run the transport, the buses, the underground, the trains, and they used to charge for that data. In fact, they used to have a group of people who would sit down, application developers, and write you applications. They were okay, but they weren't so good. They took a decision just to make it openly available, and the world just got better. People innovated with it. They took their own chance on trying to develop a product, and it all got better.
Mm-hmm. Now, this week at least, you're a European. That may change because Britain may leave the European Union, but it is highly attuned to privacy and personal information. When you say open data, does that conflict with European standards of privacy? Do you believe certain data should be protected, I take it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and often one of the biggest and most important jobs that we had was explaining very clearly to policymakers and politicians that all data wasn't the same kind of thing. When we said open it, we didn't mean we're going to open everything, you know? And we talked about, the Open Data Institute has this idea of a data spectrum from fully open to pretty well fully closed for various reasons. There is security data. There'll be various personal information that you will want to keep very, very private and very closed. You'd like to think you could. There'll be some data that you agree to share. There'll be some data that has genuine IP protection around it. our view was just that if you think of that as a big pyramid as well, at the bottom you want a big, thick base of open data, of which many services can run. And the question is, where can you set that? Now, the issue around personal data is that I think there are understandable reasons why we should try and protect the individual and the use of their data. Not just protect them, we somehow need to empower them. I think one of the problems, and this isn't a new thought, is that there's kind of an asymmetry. The state and the big corporations have huge power to get insights from your information. And often the citizen or consumer feels a little bit like, well, I guess I get a good service. This is inevitable. I'll have to give this information up. But I think there's a really interesting argument about how people can feel more in control, more empowered, and more self-determined about their information. And I think that balance will be a very interesting developing question in the future. And I think the difference between different jurisdictions will reflect that.
How do you do that? Do you create a greater data literacy, obviously, but then do you have both enforcement or pricing, a fair pricing of what you'll give up and how?
Well, I mean, there have been attempts, actually real attempts to try and begin companies where there was some kind of micro-pricing for the information you gave up, and nothing has really taken off in that area. I think it's much more around understanding what the consent in might be. There could be the idea of data cooperatives. There could be some notion that we pool our information. That can work in some areas. There is a situation where I'm prepared to have certain of my information used under certain terms and conditions, but that's for me to determine, and we don't really have a very good handle on that at the moment. You pick up your phone, you switch on your apps, and you really don't have a very strong idea of what's going where for what purpose. And just to say, well, that makes the web just work, the advertising model, that seems to me a little bit too easy to say, and we should perhaps look carefully about what's happening to your information and how you might assert more right and entitlement to those questions.
And just as we were speaking before about systems that don't explain themselves, they are going to be grafted onto data that has non-obvious uses or triangulations, so that public information can be used to determine personal information. Yeah. In some senses, it's the outcome sought that is the offense and not the methodology.
That's a fascinating challenge because, again, it's almost certainly the case that triangulation can be very exquisite. So you don't think you've disclosed large amounts of information about yourself, or indeed your information has disclosed it about your friends, but it has. And then the question is, I think we have to ask ourselves questions that have as much to do with the philosophy of law and ethics. Back to ethics again. It's interesting. We're back to ethics and governance that say, just because you know it doesn't mean you can just use it in any which way against you, an individual. And the US and the UK is well aware of these kind of issues. We have our rules of privacy. We both operate under a common law framework where the idea is that we have a reasonable expectation to privacy. We have an idea of discrimination or deceptive practice where you can't just use information about you to make certain judgments. I can't discriminate based on your age or your gender or your race. And I think those sorts of ideas about what it's reasonable to expect in terms of what is done with your information will just need to continue to evolve.
And be surfaced in a more direct way.
Indeed.
People need to name these capabilities better so that they can work with them. Well, you've been working in open data for about 8 years now. How would you judge your progress and what's left to do?
I think in many ways it's transformed landscape. Literally, we have tens of thousands of data sets that were not available. But this is unfinished business. Public data is one thing. We've also been talking to many commercial organizations to sort of say, maybe your information, some of your information would be more valuable to you and more broadly if it was simply made openly available. And we can think of that. I mean, governments occasionally and companies change their mind about what they should release. And often the open publication of information has been very, very empowering. We think the landscape has changed. I think that this is something you have to keep making the case for. There's no one reason to do open. transparency and accountability was a reason that people would say, publish the visitor logs or publish the spend rates within government. But it's also about efficiency. It's about improving things. When we publish the infection rates in our hospitals, hospital-acquired infection rates in the NHS system in England, we had a chronic problem of these infection rates. We published them, the kind of league tables of shame, which hospitals are doing well, which were doing badly. Those hospitals at the bottom got in touch with those hospitals at the top. You know what? Things got a lot better. This wasn't deep science. This was things like hygiene, washing your hands, deep cleaning. The data is powerful. It shines a light, it can improve, hold accountable, make more efficient, and lead to innovation.
Yes. The hazards and the human capability for evil and stupidity are there, but overall history does suggest that information sharing promotes scientific advancement, better pricing, a knowledge of what to build next, you name it.
Yeah.
This is potentially information sharing at a velocity no one's ever seen before.
And I think in ways that will make for all sorts of better equities, better markets, as you say, more efficiency, and it helps us kind of tackle things like corruption. I mean, fundamentally, the data on, aid or extractive industries, they just give you an idea about what the input-output function looks like, should you worry.
And you've also seen the rise of open data languages and technologies and organizations that work in an open framework, including one my employer, Google, purchased recently, Kaggle, which still runs independent data analysis contests. Have those been very impactful, and do you think that's something that will continue to develop?
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, I think they also have this very strong appeal to across the spectrum. So to civil society, as well as the public sector, as well as, I would say, potentially the private sector. If you want to think of one open data example that has been transformational, think of the human genome. There was a time when there was serious, well, it was up for IP licensing, the actual structure, the information. A brave act of politics kind of struck that down. It took some money out of the valuation of companies that thought they were going to bet on having those things locked down for their own exploitation. But the value that has been added by that being an openly available information for the world, the human genome, our basic endowment, has been transformational.
I have a few questions I want to get into combining AI and open data, but I'd like to break it up with a question from the audience. Do you believe we should build ethics for AI? How would ethics be entered into an AI system?
Well, I think what we're already seeing is a move amongst AI researchers to understand their responsibilities and the ethical dimensions of what they do. And this is already underway. In fact, Microsoft and Google DeepMind, the two individuals there, are helping chair some of this responsible AI initiative. So I think that aspect is starting to emerge. I think we'll see a lot more of it. There'll be there's already worries around the exploitation and use of big data and data analytics that relate to this whole idea about how do you ensure that these methods don't discriminate. So how do you build in both ethics and law to the process and to the companies that originate and the products that result? Now, the other question is, do you put this into can you put these into the algorithms in a meaningful way? That will be interesting to see. I mean, what would it mean if we were to put the equivalent to rules of engagement into our drones? What would it mean? Now, again, we're not supposing that the machine is meaningfully reflecting and have a metaphysical dilemma about whether it should or shouldn't, but the fact that you've tried to take some boundary rules and put them into the algorithm is certainly something I can see happening.
You said that self-awareness is years off, and really, if then, it's rather problematic. But we are already enabling machines to reprogram themselves. And if that accelerates, is it possible to shut them off? Can we stop them if they reprogram themselves?
And I think those are the dystopian futures that people have thought about and should worry about. I think you want to work out what the kill where the kill cord is, you know, and we have been in situations where we've had to unplug the algorithm in financial trading, for example, where at the limit the systems were getting into kind of very dangerous oscillations and driving down markets. They had to kind of stop the automatic trading and resume a degree of normal human intervention. And I think that would be very unwise not to always seek to put control, the human, on the loop, so that they can decide to be in the loop, should they
There's always going to be a plug you can pull out of the wall. The problem is it does something stupid really fast.
Well, and those kind of unanticipated cascades of behavior, and you can end up making. I think we always have to be asking our questions. That do we understand those boundary conditions where those unexpected events might occur, and that can sometimes catch even the best minds and the greatest companies out. The one thing humans do have that our machines don't, I would suggest, is this idea of a very strong sense of their own limits. Okay, so secretly we all know what we're kind of expert at and what we don't know, whether we're blagging it or not, whether we're, you know, and the ability to go and ask somebody who you know might have a better view on the matter is one of those kind of enduring human capabilities. So the meta-knowledge, the knowledge about what you know, what the limits of your understanding are, powerful human capability, and we need to think about applying that to our machines too.
That's very deep. Imagining something you don't know. We haven't encoded that in a computer yet. That's very interesting. A question from the audience. What are some of the research opportunities that really excite you, particularly around machine learning or symbolic reasoning? And let me make it a little more open than that. What have you been looking at that you think is just a very rich patch to work in?
I think over the years, I think the audacity of trying to build in adaptive intelligence systems has just always been a thrill. I remember back in the day, we were building systems to help design chemical plants. Then we were building systems to help analyze and advise on medical outcomes. The great repurposability of these systems means that you can find yourself in a problem area that, you know, 6 months earlier you just weren't aware of or interested in particular. I do think that, for me, one of the things that interests me is not just the pure exploitation of artificial intelligence. It's another kind of AI that I call augmented intelligence. It's the fact that we and our machines, we and our data sets, we as networks of machines and humans have some extraordinary capabilities to solve problems of scale that we've really not begun to think about as engineered systems. So what happens if I want to pull together 100,000 volunteers to help map a ruined landscape? How do I set that up? Now that's exactly an area where people are beginning to work. So when the Nepal earthquake occurred, you know, people were stood up with software tools and data from the satellites, and the machines and they were working out how to map and accurately assess the damage. Within 48 hours, they had really accurate characterizations on some of this stuff. So that wouldn't happen with a standalone system or just a computational system or a purely human response system. So I like that that blend of systems. I think that's very exciting.
Mm-hmm. Someone in the audience asked, if people have access to open data, will crime become more advanced? Have you seen abuses of the open data system?
So a good example of where there was a worry here, we persuaded the police forces in the United Kingdom to publish their reported crime data every month. All the reported crime was mapped. Now, this has actually happened in various cities and states in the US, but one of the challenges of a federal system is there are so many layers of policing, whereas we have these kind of 40-odd constabularies, the police forces. And as we were doing that, we were kind of assured that this would kind of undermine faith in the rule of law, or be the end of house prices, or just be a great tool for the kind of burglars to exploit. We've not seen any of that. What we see is that accurate portrayal of where the crime's being reported has all sorts of useful benefits. Insurance companies use it, but so do civil action groups, so do the police forces themselves. You know, they get a better sense. What we're not seeing there is, the tool of choice for your burglar to go out there and rob your house. Because the truth is, in so many of these contexts, these are opportunistic situations. So I think you'd be better if you want to look at organized crime at what's happening at scale on the attacks on our cyber physical systems and on our banking systems.
Just this week, we've seen the second rather alarming ransomware attack across multiple countries involving apparently cyber weapons heisted from the NSA and sold in the deep web to bad actors or perhaps used by states. It's not clear yet. Is that an ongoing fact of life, or do we get our hands around cybercrime?
No, I think that's going to be that's an ongoing fact of life that we are going to. It is the shape of things to come, and what we've got to work out are a number of things. I mean, one is if some of this is state sponsored. When are we going to have to grow up and get real and say this isn't any way for states in the 21st century kind of to engage in undeclared war on each other is just at some point going to be somewhat unproductive. And again, it's a bit like white collar crime, because it kind of happens in cyber, it doesn't really, but it does have real impact in the world. So what we'll have to do in terms of treaties and grown up international relations to sort of come to a better management, that will be one question. The other question around organized crime is understanding what its structure is and how it's exploiting. The real challenge, of course, is that these tools and tool sets, these exploits, these botnets, the malware, it's kind of off the shelf in the dark web, and that script kiddies and disaffected employees, people can get out there and get this stuff.
Yeah, it's sort of like what happened to music when it became infinitely copyable. You can make an infinite number of copies of this malware and just throw it in every direction at once and find a weak link somewhere.
And that'll be very testing, and it'll be a challenge. And we will occasionally find ourselves in a bad place. But again, it's an arms race. So as these things are exposed, systems have to respond. We have to make them more robust.
Very large news systems, there are providers, are better at this. And maybe centralized control of computing in large public clouds is a good thing to that end, because there are highly trained technicians doing it. The hazard there is they're very attractive targets.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's certainly the case that you will see all of us, individuals, organizations, nation states, investing more and more of our time and our energy into working out how we do respond. It's an arms race, literally.
Well, let's play current events. And I don't speak for my employer in this case, but it's pretty clear Russia had a major hand attacking not just the US, but multiple democracies, perhaps to influence outcomes, but certainly to create a certain cynicism around the quality of democracy. And what has been done, what can be done about something like that?
Well, whatever you believe or don't believe about where those things might have originated, it does seem to me to suggest we might put some serious thinking into technologies and methods for attribution. What is the provenance? Where did this stuff come from? What is the basis of evidence to support assertions about this or that? And actually, it's interesting to see already some of the large IT corporates starting to think about how they deal with so-called fake news, or how you would indicate in the streams that are coming where information has originated.
How could AI be applied to that problem?
And I think that, well, it can, in the sense that the whole question of provenance tracking, for example, the World Wide Web Consortium, the organization that looks to develop and originate recommendations and standards in this area, has one to do with provenance. How can you actually have the payload on the web carry with it its history.
Right.
And evidence of whether it's been tampered with. And I think that will become an important...
that is to say, this story about the Queen of England selling drugs appears to have originated on a private server in Bulgaria, and within 30 seconds it was on 50 bots on Twitter.
But let's,
so
I agree.
It's probably not accurate.
And that's right. And all that being said, let's not underestimate that even if you can technologically fix this, the human appetite for kind of wacky stories like that, it won't stop people reading it. And the other thing is that the echo chamber effect, that we've seen this, is that people do sometimes like to just read the stuff that reinforces what they believe. And the question about how we persuade ourselves to be a little bit more self-critical, what lessons we need to take from the way in which, as we've progressed, I look at the Enlightenment and I kind of sometimes think that set of changes about tolerance, about questioning, about the basis for argument, maybe we kind of, why shouldn't we be arguing for a digital enlightenment? Why shouldn't we be saying, why can't we use these tools in a certain sense to help us have better arguments or to get us out of entrenched positions? We've all got to imagine that perhaps we could be wrong.
Well, I think you've put your finger on an extremely difficult problem that contributed to the rise of this. People in the Silicon Valley and tech generally at Oxford are people who are more or less comfortable with being wrong because it's a sign they're about to learn something. And they've been positively rewarded in life by being wrong. For them, being wrong is a signal you're about to become intellectually stronger. You know, not in their political opinions because those are highly emotional, but they do have a certain training in appreciating being wrong. They do live with people like each other, so they don't encounter a lot of difference. So they don't have an experience like most of the world, where being wrong involves pain and uncertainty, and there isn't much learning, there's just a certain kind of shame or frustration with it. I think perhaps we need to help people encounter difference and help people learn that changing your point of view is kind of healthy.
Yeah, and I think that is a deep and enduring feature of the best of us when we do that. And I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of what has gotten to. We've gotten to where we are. We developed antibiotics. We've built these machines, not by kind of distrusting expertise or imagining any kind of fact will do, by being really rigorous about imagining that we could be wrong, we are wrong, and moving beyond that. I would just say that...
As Thomas Edison famously said, now we know 300 filaments that don't work.
That's right.
You know, and that was progress for him.
Indeed, absolutely.
But that's not a commonly held point of view.
Well, I think we could, that's a debate I think we should try and encourage more of.
Yeah, and build some AI that encourages that growth as well. Let me ask you, do you worry or consider that both AI and big data capabilities will become the province of very large corporations and the most powerful governments?
Well, actually, this is a very interesting argument, and some people talk of a kind of a new emerging North-South divide, or you know, the powerful, the haves and the have-nots. I think it would be impossible not to recognize that there are huge players now, big incumbents with enormous compute power and enormous resources that are beyond individual nations. And what are the responsibilities that attach to them? And I think it's going to be a really important question for those organizations to ask themselves, how do we, you know, okay, so how do we, you know, it's not enough to not do evil. What does it mean to do good? And actually, and I absolutely believe that those organizations are often operating for the best of reasons in the local context. But these bigger issues of governance and responsibility, and again, it's not just about being philanthropic, it's about how does an organization on that scale serve the public interest as well as the private interest? What does that look like?
And since they are increasingly transnational, how do they cooperate with the world system of governments?
And this is just such an interesting, I think, set of developments. And it's all happened so fast that I think that the people at the head of these organizations are kind of almost too busy developing and in the process of building this new world. But those bigger questions, and we talk about the ethics and responsibilities around a technology like AI, but the kind of high-level question is, at these levels of scale. Now, when in the past we've looked at monopolies, if you think of that in that way, there have been antitrust movements. There was Standard Oil. There was AT&T. And I'm not advocating it, but I think what I'm thinking is where do we go with those discussions around what is a sensible way to manage the extraordinarily creative, innovative potential, the power, the ingenuity of these organizations, and keep them in balance with the public interest and with the individual interest.
As someone who deals with the highest levels of government and also travels in a world of these tech companies, do you feel the two sides understand each other very well?
I think too often they get into particular single issues where they can find themselves on the wrong side of arguments or in some kind of conflict around a particular issue. Or they can find themselves at a particular love-in at Davos or whatever. But the real question is, what are these big questions of new settlements going to look like? And if you're in a government, certainly a Western, a liberal view of that would be it should keep us safe. And it should keep us free. Okay? And those are great values to have. And it seems to me that they're not inconsistent with corporate values. So when we talk about corporate social responsibility, it's not enough just to think about keeping the air clean or not trashing the environment. Surely it's about how do we keep the respect. How do we empower individuals? How do we make their lives better? And I'm sure many of these companies say, well, we are making their lives and their experiences better. But in the general case, what does that look like?
This is that hard work of being good that I was talking about before. It does not stop. Now, I'm going to have to ask a somewhat difficult question here. You teaching at Oxford, you tend to teach elites. And, and these systems are being written by a particular type, and yet you press for open data and you like open source systems. Is there any way in which the current system of empowerment could or should be made more diverse or improved in other ways?
Well, that word elite is a very interesting one.
It's loaded.
It's a very loaded and very interesting word, though, isn't it? I don't know how it is in the US, but in the UK, if I talk about a sporting elite, that's a phrase with power and acclamation. It's fine to be an elite sportsman. An intellectual elite somehow sounds less positive. I think we've got to take
the notion. It's a fact that the best educations are increasingly the province of the very wealthy, at least in this country.
The entire proposition of the college I come from and Oxford struggles hugely with this issue of how can we be blind to means. What we want to do is take the best people, yes, they're in some sense the best of their generation, but whatever their background and means, give them that extraordinarily unique Oxford education. We absolutely work on a daily basis. One of the reasons I'm here talking to people about access, diversity. It's not the case that we can take anybody with any kind of academic attainment and give them the benefits of an Oxford degree. No, for sure. But what we've got to try and ensure is that the equity of access to that is precisely that it's blind to where you come from in the country or what your income is. Those, of course, are hard things to get right. And making sure that you are not just stacking it only to those who can afford to pay for the best education, That is, I'm sure, a challenge in many, many, many countries, and we see it emerging all the time. So how do we constantly asking ourselves, are we making it possible for those with the talent and the passion to come to a system like ours, giving them resources to do that is absolutely part of our ethical responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've had several questions from the audience, and of course, I had my own around very advanced technical systems, artificial intelligence, and jobs. Is this going to lead to a crisis in work if we begin to create artificially intelligent robots, self-driving cars, systems capable of large abstracted work that in a short time hollows out big chunks of the employment landscape faster than we can think of new things to do?
I mean, this is being written about, discussed very much at the moment. People have got some rather alarming views on just how many jobs will be taken out. I do think it's worthwhile asking ourselves just how many jobs, new kinds of jobs we haven't thought of might come along. You know, just start to list the kinds of job that now exist that didn't exist a few years ago.
There are over 300,000 personal trainers in the United States.
So these are so what tends to happen is that there's a translation across rather than an elimination. So the things that humans require in terms of social and physical contact that other humans provide, I don't see them being disintermediated too fast. And whether it's personal trainers or elder care assistants, people who just practicing in social care contexts or creative industries, there are just so many contexts, I think. And then, of course, our own subjects are generating new professions. I can bet you before too long there'll be an entire new cadre of accountants. There'll be algorithmic accountants. There'll be data accountants. There'll be people who worry about the nature and origin of the data sets that are driving our... there'll be no shortage of lawyers, more lawyers, I suspect. And people say, well, will anybody be driving cars? Will anybody be driving the fleets of trucks? And I think, again, that we do well to ask ourselves what has happened with these technical developments in the past and how quickly have the new jobs come on stream. Now, some people say, look, globally, there's a challenge because won't the jobs go from those countries least able to sustain them? And I think, again, that will be a question we'll have to look to. So I'm not certain on how the trajectory could be there. My sense is that the short-term devastation of our employment markets, I'm not convinced that's going to happen.
I do like the hand of the West a little bit better than those countries dependent on lots of repetitive manufacturing jobs.
Yeah. You'd bet that. Yeah, you'd want to back that. Yeah.
Because well before the Industrial Revolution, technology has automated things, and essentially that means freeing people to do things more like what people are good at.
Yeah.
And there's no reason to think that isn't still happening, just in a somewhat new framework. Yeah. And I looked this up. This was interesting. 100 years ago, the price of an Enrico Caruso recording and the price of a ticket to see Enrico Caruso were exactly the same. And today, music is free in a digital form, but if you want to see a band, it can be hundreds of dollars.
Yes.
And that echoes what you were saying about home healthcare workers. People are now paying a premium to have human experiences.
Yes.
And that may be a very, very rich area to get into.
Very enduring feature. And if you wanted to kind of, back a future in which you wanted to get the double benefits of having a data literate culture as well, why not just kind of up the number of teachers by an order of magnitude? That could be quite a good thing to invest in.
I have a final question. I'm curious about what a life in AI has done for how you think about the world. And let me start in this context. If you talk to geologists, they'll talk about learning how to think in deep time. And they will see a rock face and think in millions of years, something most of us aren't capable of. I'm wondering if a lifetime of seeing things grow exponentially, such as computation or software complexity, has changed your ability to project forward or how you think about progress?
Well, I certainly think that one thing that happens is you begin to see the world through the lens of computation. And computational thinking actually is a phrase that Jeanette Wing, previous president of the ACM, came up with as something that is quite a valuable way to make sense of the world in terms of data and structure and algorithms. It's one way of making sense. The issue of these extraordinary rates of change, those have been truly humbling. I think it made me realize not just how connected our modern society is, but the huge scale at which things operate. So the ability to even produce a class of next generation chips to drive the Internet of Things or our next generation of phones is an undertaking that's extraordinary. We used to stand in awe of the people who built the great cathedrals of medieval Europe, but the ingenuity that we pour in to the nanoscale is something that I find sets the hairs on the back of my neck on
Yes, and the scale at which we are aware of and cooperating with each other. On a purely material level, I knew a guy who sold chips into cell phones, and he said, this is the first time in history you can make something and expect to sell 100 million of it.
Just extraordinary. But the converse of that, what a lifetime in AI has taught me, is that nobody knows. Everybody knows something and nobody knows everything. And there's no sense in which any one person, no matter how bright they are on the planet, could make a cell phone themselves. And that disconnect, that level of dependency that we've now built in our entire technical culture is very interesting. So we are much more deeply dependent on one another than perhaps ever for this style of being in the world and our economies. And a final point I'd say on that is that a lifetime in AI has given me a profound respect for the human sense of consciousness and cognitive presence in the world, that there is so much about us that isn't anywhere in our programs yet.
I'm delighted to say it's made you an optimist and an enthusiast as well. Maybe you were always that way, but a life in it didn't
We can all
hurt.
be dystopian about this, but I think actually I'd prefer to try and remain cheerfully optimistic.
Best way to go forward. I'm sorry we don't have more time. That is all we have for tonight. But on behalf of World Affairs, I ask you to join me in thanking Sir Nigel Shadbolt for this excellent discussion. And thanks to you, the audience, for your terrific questions. Good night.
Thank you very much.